Thank you for joining us. Even if you aren't joining us live, we hope to get to all the questions that you may have about the DSM proposal that we announced a couple weeks ago at this point. So yeah, we just wanted to kind of hop on here with Dr. Prudence Fisher. You may have seen and met her before on some of our previous Facebook Lives, but I'll let her give a short little introduction here in just a minute. And then we're going to dive into the process of the DSM proposal submission, as well as what the next steps are, and answer any questions that you may have. So if you have questions throughout this Facebook Live, go ahead and drop them into the comments below. If you're watching this at a later time, go ahead and also drop your comments in there, and we will try to get back to those and answer you as soon as we can. So anyway, I'm Samantha. I'm always hosting our Facebook Lives here at the NVLD project, and we're very excited about this Facebook Live and all the information and hopefully what it means for the NVLD community. But I am now going to turn it over to Dr. Prudence Fisher, if you just want to introduce yourself again. And then I think we'll start with kind of a little bit of the history of the DSM, as well as how we got to this point and what went into that proposal process. So.
Okay, so I'm Prudence Fisher. I'm associate professor at Columbia in the Division of Child Psychiatry. My Ph.D. is actually in social work, not psychiatry or psychology. And I got involved in this project, well, because the NVLD project had a connection with my division. And I'd had some experience working with the DSM system on the DSM-5. I was an advisor, so I knew pretty much what the process was. And I also had a nephew who had NVLD, so I was familiar with what it was and sort of the importance of it being recognized, and knowing that when he was diagnosed, I had no idea what it was. Okay. And so one of the reasons I think it was important to get in DSM was not only because you often need a DSM diagnosis to get treatment or accommodations if they're needed, so it can increase access for services, but I think almost as importantly is that the DSM, although it wasn't designed for this purpose, is often used as a textbook in graduate training, medical training. And that's how people in the mental health field learn about diagnoses, not only that they exist, but how to think about them, how they interrelate to each other. So it could increase recognition and communication. So for example, everybody in schools knows what ADHD is, people know what autism is, they know what a learning disorder is, etc. And those are all in the DSM, and this one wasn't. It can also improve some diagnostic formulations by improving communication, that people start considering it. Like, this is something people have. So often somebody can come in with something else and they could have this in addition to it, or it could be this and not that. So it's pretty important. And from my point of view as a researcher, it improves the research because it provides a standard definition, which is one of the things that DSM does. But so the latest version of DSM came out in 2013, which, if you think about it, that's almost 9 years ago, right? And what they did, and it's DSM-5 with a Roman numeral, not a Roman numeral, an Arabic numeral, like a regular 5 as opposed to an IV. And the idea is that it can change as new information is learned. And they've adopted what they call a continuous revision process, in which they've set up a steering committee that will take proposals for further changes. So you don't have to wait 20 years for DSM-6 to come out, that they can make some of the changes along the way. And in fact, they just came out with a text revision. The DSM-5 is set up where you have the regular diagnoses, but then they also have a section 3, which are things that are being considered that need further research until they get into the main book. And it serves an important purpose because it gets a standard definition out. It makes sure researchers and everybody are looking at the same thing. And that's particularly important for something like NVLD, which never had a standard definition. So it's very hard to go straight into the main book until you have more research on the definition that is being proposed. So what happens in terms of submitting a proposal, they have a portal and you put in the proposal and then it goes to a steering committee. And I'll talk about the exact proposal a little bit later. And the steering committee reads it and says, should this go forward at all? Or should we send it back and they have to do something else? Or I don't think they would say right out no, but you never know. And then if it goes forward, they give it to a subcommittee, and the subcommittee we would go to would be the neurodevelopmental disorders. And then that subcommittee can either review it themselves, or what will probably happen, or what will happen actually, is they would bring in other people with expertise, because the neurodevelopmental disorders cover all of the disorders that are neurodevelopmental disorders. So it's learning disorders, communication disorders, autism, motor disorders, ADHD, etc. So they would bring in somebody probably who has more experience than the 5 or 6 people on that committee with cognitive stuff. So they get advisors and etc. And so that's where we think it'll go to them. And then it goes through a process where you get public comments. They'll maintain a website, it will be up there, and they want comments from the field. So when it goes up, I'm sure there'll be some sort of announcement or something, or you can keep track of the APA website, but there is a period where there are comments, and then those go back to the committee and they might work with us, etc. That's pretty unclear exactly how that's going to work, but that's how it has worked before, and I imagine it will work in the future. So,
and really quick, who is that comment section open to? Is it professionals with
everybody, anybody?
Okay.
They ask you to identify who you are, and you can write anything like, this is a stupid idea, right? I mean, they get all sorts of comments. And the regular DSM-5, I mean, people think, oh, you're sending your comment to a black hole or something. That isn't. They do read the comments.
Yeah.
So, and they respond to them, or I guess since we would be proposing it, we would have to help them respond to it. But it is really taken into account. So if you don't think the criteria so people respond, it can be anybody.
Okay.
But I think they might consider who it is. I mean, if it's somebody who just like writes 2 words, it's like, well, what are we supposed to do about that? But so I mean, you should think about what you write. So what was interesting to me, not being an NVLD person, I was an NVLD person, is the definitions. Like if you're going to propose something, to propose a new disorder, you need to say what the disorder is. And DSM has a specific sort of way that they write criteria. Like you sort of have to have it looking like a DSM diagnosis. So it can't say, oh, it's this on the block design case and it's this. You can't sort of do any of that. And remembering that DSM is a manual for clinicians, so it has to be written in such a way that a typical clinician can use it. And so the first thing we did was we did 2 things. We undertook a literature review to see what are people calling, like what are the criteria the researchers use. And we sort of looked at some of the clinical stuff, but we did a literature review of all the research criteria. And also doing that of the empirical literature, it also let us uncover a lot of stuff we would have to use later in proposals supporting that we're doing that. But we're sitting here at Columbia, like, who are we to make up the definition? And one of the things you do want from DSM is to have some buy-in from the field. Like I can write criteria, but I'm like one woman sitting in office, and so and we needed help from the field. And so the NVLD project actually funded us to have 2 conferences at Columbia in which we invited NVLD experts, people who were known in the field. They'd published in the field, they thought about it, they come up with criteria, they did research. And so we invited them. And then we had a lot of experts in terms of related fields like autism, ADHD, anxiety, some methodology people. We had DSM person, and clinicians, people who are using it, educators, etc. And so we had two conferences. They were about, I think, 18 months apart, where we came up with the criteria. And later on, before the second conference, the NVLD project had set up a scientific advisory board of known experts in psychopathology assessment, not necessarily NVLD, but all the related areas, and they're well known in the field. And were, considered by the field to be sort of like the top of the top. So to get their sort of input, like how are they reacting? Because you can submit a proposal for NVLD, but the people who are looking at it aren't experts in NVLD, and so you have to, does it look like a disorder? Have I ever seen? So they were invited. So by the end, it was a really iterative process. And actually, when I thought about it, it sort of very much resembled the process that was used in the regular DSM-5 committees, where you go back and forth. What do you think about this? And people were voting on it and writing things in. And so we sort of coordinated the whole process. And there were lots of emails, lots of conference calls. Occasionally we would have them vote on something. And then we also learned a lot, because along the way we developed the survey, and we noticed what the criteria didn't quite make sense when you're starting to ask questions, and you need clarifications. And we shopped it around to NVLD people as well as people who were not NVLD people. And we also sought some stakeholder opinions on the names. And so there's a long iterative process when we were doing this. And so in the end, we came up with a definition that doesn't look exactly how people have been conceptualizing NVLD before. And so basically the diagnosis we came up with has 4 parts to it, but the focus is on visual spatial problems. Because a lot of the things that were in some of the definitions of NVLD were not unique to people with NVLD. Like you could have stuff with executive functioning, but that's also very common in kids with ADHD. Or you can have motor coordination problems, or you could have whatever. So it wasn't unique to NVLD.
Are you able to explain why it's important to have something that's unique to NVLD that doesn't share with the other disorders that are already in the DSM? Because, we do have a bunch of people out there that say this isn't what it looks like and this isn't what it is, but there's a reason behind why it was done this way. Are you able to explain?
There are 2 things with DSM. Okay. One of the things was that there are different cognitive domains when you think of cognition. So there's attention, you have ADHD, there's speech, you have speech things. They didn't have anything for visual spatial things. So there was a hole there. That was one place there was a hole. Another thing, by making it always overlap, if it always overlaps, one of the questions is, well, is it something, or is it just a characteristic of another disorder? So you did want it sort of there by itself. And with DSM, one of the worries was, and one of the things we got advice on, is that you should have what this one thing is, and the other things can be associated features. So there was nothing else that was necessary, right? So we had these thought experiments where people say, well, the people I see with NVLD are always really anxious. And we say, well, have you ever seen somebody with it who wasn't anxious? Well, yeah, they're those kids too. Or have you ever, so there's nothing that was absolutely necessary. But it was generally agreed that people with visual spatial problems often are impaired in other areas. And it's seen more in line with how DSM conceptualizes things to capture those as common associated features, common impairments. So your visual spatial thing is making you anxious, but it's not part of the core part of the disorder. And it also aligns much more with the new perspective that's being taken in IMH, the research domain criteria, where you pick out a single thing. And it was thought that would fit much neater there. And then the research can show, are there other things that are always there? And there's no way to make a decision on how many of those other things somebody had to have. And in fact, as it turns out, a lot of the empirical research didn't support parts of those definitions. Like part of those definitions are always saying, oh, they have all these motor problems. But when there would be a research that looked specifically at people who were diagnosed with NVLD versus people who didn't find a difference. So we couldn't actually justify including all that stuff as well. Because, so it's out there, and that's why it's and so we'll see what the field says. I mean, that's why they're associated features. So we did that through thought experiment. So the first thing it is the big one, and in DSM, the big one is always the A criteria, is that they have persistent deficits in processing or integrating visual and spatial information, which are manifested in all these areas. And we came different kinds of examples of that, and so they had to have, we listed a bunch of areas, and they had like 4 of those. And of course that would be tested. Do you need 4? Do you need 5? Whatever. But you have to make a rule that you can test. And then the second part is where the developmental comes in, is that they have to be present in your early developmental period, which is true of all the neurodevelopmental disorders. They start when you're younger. And one of the reasons we wanted to have that is because you didn't want to get people who later, say, got in a car accident. It's something obvious, so you wanted it to be in sort of like the person sort of been like that. And that's what all the neurodevelopmental disorders have. And one of the reasons we actually use developmental is because we wanted to make sure it got in that chapter, because that's when it's typically identified during childhood. Not that people don't grow up. I mean, people with autism grow up, people with ADHD grow up, but it's typically identified during childhood. Or you could take a careful history and see that it was there during childhood. And it's sort of, so it's thought in that same vein. Now, when it's being considered, it could be that people want the developmental dropped. I mean, I think it's good to have it, but I'm not making the rules. I mean, that's why it was there. We certainly wanted it to end up in that committee. Things that aren't there. Let me see. Oh, the other thing is a lot of the literature, things that aren't there that some people might object to. Is a lot of people think you have to have a full neuropsychological battery, right? And indeed that's how typically this is diagnosed. In DSM, it's not typical to require any particular tests, etc. We do recommend that people get testing, but it's not required. And part of that is in a way to solve some of the healthcare disparities, in that who can afford to go have these batteries and who are they available to and who they aren't. And some of the things you could find out other ways, uneven profiles, etc. The other thing is a lot of the literature has excluded people who have autism or have, I don't know, ADHD or, whatever. Then in DSM-5, when they came out in DSM-5, it used to be in DSM-5 you couldn't give somebody with autism a diagnosis of ADHD, right? In DSM-5 you can, because often people with autism might have ADHD, or somebody with autism could have a learning disorder. And this is the same thing. Like, why are we saying that that trumps that? And because there are people with autism who could have this, but not everybody with autism has this. And there are some people with NVLD who can have autism, but there are people who don't. So there's not a clear overlap. And in fact, that was something that we had to show in the literature review. So we're allowing them to be in overlap. So what is not in the criteria? The other thing that's not in the criteria that may be controversial is a lot of the definitions for NVLD have that the person had strong verbal abilities, that they had to strengthen this. But do they have to? I mean, to have a visual spatial disorder, do you have to have very good verbal abilities? Actually, there has been some research that's shown some of their verbal abilities aren't that great. So it depends how you measure it. It also probably depends to a certain extent on who got tested, because people will generally be identified who might have come from more literate more literature in their house, and might have verbal abilities sort of more environmentally than other people. So are you saying that people who came from a different background that still have it can't have NVLD? So I did say about the thought experiments, associated features and stuff. So those are the things that we imagine there will be some feedback from the field on. So in terms of putting the proposal together, the big thing, well, the first thing and sort of your sales thing is you're justifying why you're doing this. And if you think about you're justifying, it's sort of like your sales pitch for putting it in. Like, why is it important to be in DSM? What is the gap in the system it's fulfilling? So we made the point about other cognitive domains are represented, that people with NVLD often have other problems, that there's a need for accommodations, it's not being recognized, et cetera, et cetera. So we did that. And then you have to, so besides that, you have to talk about the historical context of NVLD, in this case, DVSD. We sort of had to rake through all the literature, what was support, what was known, what wasn't known. And we also had to discuss, and I should have said this before, another reason for the name change is we don't think it's useful to call it a learning disability. Because in DSM, the learning disabilities are about academic problems. So you have and they're called specific learning, and then with math, with reading, with this and that. And this is something that we think of being more like ADHD or a language disorder that can affect learning, but can also affect a lot of other things in your life, you know. And so we think it was a mistake to get it just stuck in the learning disability thing. And a lot of places where you find people diagnosed in the past and with NVLD, it was like other or unspecified or something like that, or a not otherwise specified. And not learning disorder not otherwise specified isn't included in DSM-5. So the sort of the place that people would put that, it's gone. But it's probably not a good idea to call learning disorder anyway. Other things you have to do in the proposal, that it meets the DSM criteria for mental disorder. Okay, that there's a positive benefit to harm ratio, that you're not just diagnosing everybody walking down the street, that there are people who actually can use some help, and they might have been identified in the wrong place. They're not being, the whole person isn't being considered because you're not considering an important domain. Will it help advance research? So you put all this stuff in. The avoiding a substantial overlap with another diagnosis, that not everybody has this, already has something, so they're already in there. which would mean it could just be a specifier, not its own diagnosis. And then there's a lot of stuff on the validity. Well, I'll step back for a second. One of the ways we did the overlap with the other diagnoses is there are some studies, one of which was done by Amy Margolis at Columbia, that show that although kids with NVLD and kids with autism have, a lot of them can have social problems. But in terms of their brains, it's a different part of their brain that seems associated with it. So there is a differential there. And then I had done a lot of stuff looking at comparing NVLD kids with these kids. So there was a lot of differentiation there that was found, although the research wasn't that great. And then we did some surveys of people, adults who had NVLD speaking about themselves, and parents of kids with NVLD. And we didn't find that when we looked at going back, has your child ever been given this diagnosis? There's no one diagnosis they all fell into. So it wasn't like, oh, we're just taking this whole group of people who used to get autism, now we're calling them this. That just didn't happen. They were sort of all over the map. So it wasn't like there was this whole thing. In terms of the validators, one of the problems has been that there hasn't been any research on developmental visual spatial disorders specifically. And there hasn't been a whole lot of research on NVLD. And that is one of the reasons it would go into section 3 with something that needs more research. But you still have to follow the same process of like, sort of accumulating everything there is and presenting it. So they feel that it's promising that more research could like knock it over, into the main book. So we spent my literature review was helpful with that, but since my literature review happened, there's other research. So we had to summarize all that research. And so, the other thing that we're doing that's in progress is we're launching a vignette study to see if typical clinicians can actually use our criteria, where we've written up all these cases of people who meet our criteria, and some have autism, some have other things, and seeing if they can differentiate and correctly apply the criteria. So we submitted through the portal, but I should also say about the name. So in the surveys I did, we did ask people about the name, right? And overall, changing the name from nonverbal learning disability to developmental visual spatial disability disorder was positive. It was, people said, well, some people said about 10%, the new name's not better, but I don't have a strong opinion. There were about 10 to 15% of people who said, well, I don't really like the new name, but the other name is really confusing. Like, you need to do something about the name, maybe not your name. And very few, less than 1% of people said, no, you shouldn't change the name at all. So, one of the reasons you want to keep the old name so people know where to put people. And so what we said, even though we had this new name called developmental visual spatial disorder, we would include a parenthetical that says nonverbal learning disability, in the same way that social anxiety has a parenthetical that says social phobia disorder. When things change, persistent depressive disorder has something that says dysthymia, so people would know, yeah, this is where this is coming from. But, we'll see. And I'm sure that's one of the things that that there will be feedback on. So I think we sent it at the end of April. I think it went in April 28th, I think. And so we're waiting. So May, yeah. So it's been, I think it went in the end of April. And so we're waiting to hear. We thought we would get something indication back if it's moving forward or they had additional questions, but they haven't gotten back to us. The person who heads the developmental visual spatial disorder, not the steering committee is at Columbia. And I haven't bothered him because I was giving it 60 days before I sent an email to ask him what was going on. And it may be that part of it was APA had their big convention in May. COVID's going on. Everybody's still working remotely. People are on summer vacations. Apparently, the steering committee meets about once a month, but they probably didn't have a May meeting because they were at their thing. Now we just had the 4th of July holiday, so it might be longer because maybe it's their July meeting. But we're sort of waiting to hear what they say. We are going ahead with doing the reliability study and hoping it, if worse comes worse and they come back and say we really don't like criterion A5, we could pull it out in the middle of the study and just go on without it or something. But we are going ahead and doing it.
But there's no like standard timeline on this review process. Like we could hear tomorrow or we could hear in a year. Like there's no.
Apparently we were told by somebody close to DSM that it would take 2 or 3 months and that we would hear something from them. And whether it's moving forward or whether they're kicking it back and they want more information. I mean, we think it will move forward. And we do think there's no reason not to put it in section 3 because that's supposed to be sort of an experimental section. And hopefully it will generate more research and we're actually collecting more data on it. So what we're doing in terms of the research side should be helpful in that way.
Good. Okay. Cool.
I feel like I just talked for like.
I mean, there's a lot. There's so much history that goes into like how we got here and what the process was up until this point and why certain decisions were made in the best interest of getting it in the proposal. It's not that these were just like thrown around and not researched and like well developed. Like all of the things that went into this proposal were to give it the best chance of making it in instead of it being kicked out right away and being told no. Like there are specific reasons, and this is how every disorder or diagnosis that's in the DSM has had to go through this process, right? This is
well actually it's not. I mean, the disorders originally, I mean, it's pretty interesting. My understanding is to get something in that's new is much harder.
Yeah.
And some of the things originally were just in there and it was hard to get them out. I mean, there are things that are currently in DSM that have very little evidence for them. But they don't want to change, they want to, and that happens because a lot of the DSM-3, when it was first done, people sat down and sort of made up diagnoses and some work better than others. And then people start using them and then they don't want to get rid of them. But then ever since starting with DSM-4, DSM-5, they wanted everything really based on carefully thought out things. And so that's why, there weren't that many changes from DSM-4 to DSM-5. I mean, there were some because you had to have so much research to make any kind of change. And to take something out, you also, it's more difficult. And often the research wasn't there for some of the things, but they're not taking anything anymore in the main book without research to back it up.
Okay.
And there have been things that have been proposed, that couldn't be. So for example, and people see this a lot, sensory processing disorder didn't make it in. And that's because it was always comorbid with something else. You never saw it without, I think, 2 other disorders. And so there were things like that. And the other thing is that we wanted to avoid, to be quite honest, is to have this seen as a guild issue. which was one of the problems with sensory processing disorder. A lot of people viewed it as, oh, people with occupational therapy want this in, and it's like, well, I mean, people with autism have that problem, but it's like, and so you didn't want to write it in such a way that they would have to have all these very expensive batteries, because that's just, and it's like, oh, so these people just want to get, so there is, to be quite honest, from my observation, there is some politics sort of involved to a certain extent. Of course, now somebody from DSM will watch me saying that, but and say, "Oh, no, there's not." But I think you have to sort of be cognizant of who's going to review it, and there are people who think NVLD doesn't exist. Like, you're just basing it on all these cognitive tests, but like, unlike DSM, you're not requiring impairments. Then in terms of DSM, you wouldn't have a disorder, right?
Yeah.
So you can have a really great verbal skills and compared to that really low visual spatial skills, but you're still running a company now. You didn't get the disorder because you are not having impairment. So I mean, that wasn't a good example, but there are those kinds of things that you have to build into the definition. We did try out in our survey, which we haven't published yet, using this definition with people who were self-identified and diagnosed with NVLD, and they met the criteria, the new criteria. Mm-hmm. So we do think the new criteria probably will pick up people who are currently being diagnosed with NVLD.
Okay.
The worry would be if you pick up a bunch of people who aren't, but we think the impairment criteria should take care of that. But it's an empirical question. I mean, it's going to be in section 3. And that, I mean, the whole reason of that is so people can investigate it and see how well it works. And is there something that's missing, like something really necessary that's missing? Or did we make it too hard to get the diagnosis? Or did we make it too easy? So that's what it's there to be examined.
Okay. Cool.
So.
Yeah.
No question.
No, we do. I was just looking at something really quick to make sure. Okay. So I do have a couple of questions. We've kind of talked about DSM. We've talked about the proposal. We've talked about the name change and the criteria. We've a little bit touched on like what the next steps would be depending on the response from the committee when it comes back. So we are going to go ahead and open it up to questions. I'm just kind of going through what we've already got here. So if someone could not have a full psychological assessment, how else might they be diagnosed?
Well, the criteria we wrote out would be something a clinician could ask about. Mm-hmm. And we recommend that they might have some testing, but often people have had a basic IQ test, or they would have had educational records, or they would teach you reports like, I give him this and he can't do that. Or so we try to reword or redefine a lot of the things that and problems people might have into ways that could be recognizable.
Okay.
Like, does he have a hard time like navigating familiar places? Like, does he often get lost in the grocery store, or does he have a hard time reading a map, or just things that people that would be illustrative of the different domains of visual spatial stuff.
So more just like a conversation with that.
Yeah, so you would have a lot of ways to ask about the different domains.
Okay.
And so, which could be verified by more testing or something, but it's supposed to be a synthesis of all the information you have. And like most of the things, especially when you're diagnosing things in children, usually to do a good evaluation, you would want to get information from the parents, mm-hmm. from the child, from the teachers, You know, what do his drawings look like in terms of the paper? Where is his work on the paper? You know, things like can't use the space in the paper. So they're examples of the kinds of impairments somebody would have.
Okay. I'm going to read the whole thing and then we can pick it apart. In other diagnoses recently added to the DSM, the support group listed the new diagnosis code when it takes effect in a letter to give to providers. The thought was to increase research by getting the code widely used. I'm assuming what she means is the stuff that was recently added. Is that part of what that proposal included was the support group? Do you know?
No. Okay. So first of all, there have been very few diagnoses added.
Yeah.
Right. So the one that is recently added was the depression, the bereavement one. And so it says very clearly in section 3, you can't use these yet.
Okay.
Once it gets moved to the main book, then it gets the number, the ICD number or whatever that you can bill for services.
Okay.
Right. So it can't be officially used as a medical diagnosis until it's not in section 3 anymore.
Okay.
Because it's designated as something that's still it's still out there. Other things that are in that section are suicidal behavior disorder, non-suicidal self-injury, fetal alcohol syndrome, which still isn't in the other part of the book. Now, one of the things people might do is if it starts getting a lot of research, then it could go in as a neurodevelopmental disorder not otherwise specified. You can write in what it was. We can use that number. I would imagine that would happen before it gets its own number. But, you know, that's a whole other thing.
What would be the process from getting it to section 3 into the section where it can be used or coded?
What would be the process? To have more research on it.
Okay. So this is to help get more research done so that we can go through it. Got it.
Research doesn't have to just be, you know, the research can be how many people in the community meet this criteria, you know, just like basic epidemiological research.
Yeah.
Or if you identify people using this and then you could see that you could do some sort of intervention, but something to support it, you know, going out there. I think also could be useful just to get some research on usability, usefulness, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
So, but basically, you need some research using the new definition.
Will NVLD or DBSD, it being in section 3, allow people to get help from insurance?
No.
No. Okay. And then another question is the name change worldwide or will it still be NLD in the UK? Essentially, is the DSM used worldwide? Is it kind of?
I don't know. I mean, ICD is the international classification, and the DSM maps onto ICD.
Okay.
It's not well covered in the ICD. It's not covered as a developmental disorder.
Okay.
In fact, often you get people in what's described in the ICD as having, you know, later life injuries.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things we wanted it to be in that chapter as opposed to a chapter on cognitive problems where it would never be found.
Yeah.
You know, there's also that, like what chapter do you want it in, where people are going to be educated as to what chapter it's in.
Yeah. Cool. And then I have a last question for now that I can see. Why did we not make it a specialized type of ADHD given the similarities between the two? I mean, I think that kind of
people with it don't have ADHD.
Yeah. So you have to differentiate.
And by the way, making a special type of ADHD would be just as hard.
Yeah.
Because I was on the advisory for the ADHD group. And so they were thinking about carving out ADD without H, because I suspect a number of those people have this, right? But it's the same thing. You have to do the whole proposal. It would be the same proposal.
Yeah.
And given that there are people with NVLD who don't have ADHD, why make it part of that diagnosis?
Yeah.
It's the same process.
Yeah. And just to follow up on the insurance question, and I know the answer to this, but I'm going to let you speak to it, is wasn't the reason for adding NVLD to the DSM was to help get funding from research or to get funded from insurance, but
yeah, it absolutely.
it is.
But
Yeah.
it's not going to get into the main book until it goes through section 3.
Because we need more research.
It's developed enough to put it in the main book and have insurance accepted. So
Will having it in section
getting it in the main book, a necessary step.
Yeah. And we need more research, and will section 3 allow more funding to be available for this research?
It's possible. These people are interested in visual spatial as a domain.
Yeah.
And I think it's in terms of research funding and the kind of research that gets funded about like visual spatial, I think you would get more, I think it would be easier to get research based on visual spatial than on NVLD.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And then we did have another question, but we covered it at the beginning of the Facebook Live. So if you're asking about the DSM and how long it might take, if you just want to go back and watch this video after we end today, the video will be available on Facebook so that you can rewatch the whole thing if you want. And it does have closed captioning on there, I believe. But yeah, you can go back and look at what Dr. Fisher was saying about kind of how long and how this process works. The DSM is no longer just an actual physical book, so they are doing more updates, more common than they used to in the past. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it is a little bit faster of a process than it was, say, a decade ago. Correct? Yeah.
A little bit.
A little bit. Not a whole lot, but a little bit. Cool. So that was all the questions that we currently have live on the Facebook Live. If you are tuning in now and you have any questions that you want to ask and we are no longer live, you can always still drop those in the comments. We will be going through collecting those questions and sending them over to get whatever responses we might be able to get. There are some things that we may not be able to answer just depending on what the question is, because of the proposal process. So like if we don't have an answer for you, it's just that we probably aren't able to kind of share that information yet. But we are trying to share as much as we can, which is why we wanted to host this today. So I know there were a lot of questions. But yeah, so
thank you.
Do you have anything else that you would want to end on, or you're like, I've talked a lot?
I would like to address the insurance question because
yeah.
Obviously, we wanted to get in DSM because ultimately we want people to be able to use it.
Yes.
Now, it's not just to give us more research money, but it's because you want it to be recognized and used. But an insurance company isn't going to pay until it becomes official. Mm-hmm. And DSM isn't going to make it more official until they have more scientific backing. So the way to sort of get it out there and have people be interested in it and start getting that backing so it can be moved into the main book, the first thing was to get a definition that everybody could look at, comment on, and research. So then there's some research behind the definition. The problem with NVLD was that everybody's using different definitions.
Yeah.
And including different things. And that's why we had these 2 conferences and numerous emails and phone conversations and meetings to finally reach consensus in a group that was like herding cats, frankly. And, finally, people really having, I have, so it wasn't done like we just thought, oh, we're just going to change it and change the world. Every single decision was pretty debated. And it will be debated again because it will go up And I would say that there will be a lot of comments. I think there'll probably be a lot of comments on both sides. There are people that don't even think it exists, and you shouldn't put it in. And people have this, and it's just people being wimpy and being overprotective and whiny, and there is that whole group. And people not wanting to pathologize other people, and you can't, like, a lot of people meet this and it's not a real thing, it's just being a kid. And you do have sort of an anti-diagnostic movement. So there are going to be those people, and then there'll be people who think you need a million tests. So I'm sure we're going to get a lot of comments the minute it goes up, right? So we'll see.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I hope that everybody learned a little bit about the process and what goes into it. It has definitely been years in the making to get to this point, as far as like the consensus meetings, which I was lucky enough to be a part of one of those when I first joined the NVLD project. And it's amazing the amount of knowledge that was in that room at one time, like so overwhelming. But yeah, it's been an exciting process, and we are super excited that the proposal has been submitted, and looking forward to what's next and what they say. So we will try to keep everybody as updated as possible as we have updates, and with what we can share and update you with. So definitely stay tuned to our Facebook page. We have been sharing updates by email as well. So if you're not on our email list and you want those updates as they come out, that is probably the best way to get them. And yeah, if you're watching this later, drop your questions in the comments. We'll collect all those and try to get them all answered at one time, probably sometime next week after we've gotten that collection together. So thank you again, Dr. Fisher, for your time. Super appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Okay, bye.